The pandemic has illustrated the critical role that data can play in policymaking, right? Almost overnight, we've become accustomed to consuming epidemiological and other scientific information on the COVID-19 virus that have arrived at us via news, via social media, via dashboards, etc. Data-related lexicon such as flatten the curve became a daily staple of conversations. And all of this happened at an unprecedented speed. Between late January and mid-March of this year, 900 papers and reports had already been published in English language alone, according to Nature. For those who are familiar with the typically slow process of academic publications, this record is simply astounding. Throughout our discussions in this forum, panelists and our audience highlighted the importance of data, quantitative and qualitative, as I mentioned earlier, in helping us make sense of priority areas emerging from this crisis, but also in ensuring accountability and driving informed policy reform and response. Also at the forefront of many of these conversations was the potential role of philanthropy in advancing research efforts and in supporting policy and advocacy responses to this crisis. So we're going to turn our attention now to a panel that brings together researchers and representatives from different funding agencies. And I am absolutely thrilled to invite a fantastic lineup of panelists and an incredible moderator to close our forum by helping us set an evidence-driven agenda for the impact and aftermath of COVID-19 on youth justice. Please join me in welcoming to this panel Mr. Nate Baylis from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. With more than 15 years of experience in juvenile justice, social policy, research, evaluation, and system reform, Nate serves as the director of the Foundation's Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. He now leads the Foundation's efforts to expand the work of local juvenile detention alternative initiative sites to the dispositional end of the system. Nate is helping local jurisdictions safely reduce incarceration and other out-of-home placements while introducing innovations to help them improve their juvenile justice systems. It is my pleasure to welcome you, Nate, to this panel. Also with us today is Dr. Rebecca Coleman. She is the director of the Bureau of Research, Evaluation, and Performance Analytics at the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. As Bureau Director, she oversees a team of research scientists dedicated to integrating data and research into OCFS's policies and practices. The Bureau conducts research and evaluation studies to improve understanding of the needs, of the circumstances, and of outcomes of children and families touched by juvenile justice and child welfare practices. Dr. Coleman's recent portfolio of work includes a wide array of child welfare and juvenile justice related projects, including detention reform, race equity, and raising the age of criminal responsibility in New York State. Welcome, Becky. With us here today also is Dr. Lee Bates. Dr. Lee Bates has over 10 years of experience in criminal justice research and policy analysis in New York State. As the Director of Research at the Division of Criminal Justice Services Office of Justice Research and Performance, she has assisted with numerous criminal justice and interagency initiatives, including evaluating the impact of New York's 2009 drug law changes, assessing criminal justice programs and practices to improve alignment with the evidence base, and overseeing the development of the Criminal Justice Knowledge Bank and Research Consortium, which seeks to promote the use of evidence-based practices and support local practitioner and researcher partnerships. If you haven't checked that out, I urge you to do so, and hopefully our colleagues at the CJS can share the link on the chat box. As Director of Research, Lee oversees research related to youth justice, bail reform, and other criminal justice initiatives. To to this panel, LEIGH. With us here today also is Tonya Cook from Ford Foundation. Tonya directs the Ford Foundation's gender, racial, and ethnic justice team, focusing on issues of mass incarceration, immigration, and reproductive justice. Previously, Tonya served as distinguished lecturer at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, teaching courses on public policy and working on school-to-prison pipeline issues. Prior to that, Tonya was a program director on criminal justice for the Open Society Institute and a program manager for the U.S. Human Rights Fund. She also served as a senior consultant to the Atlantic Philanthropies from 2010 to 2013, while running a strategic planning consulting practice for social justice nonprofits and philanthropies. Welcome, Tonya. All right, here with us also is Dr. Megan KURLYCHEK. Megan is professor of sociology, criminology, and public policy at Penn State University. She is also one of the founders of the Institute, and I am so, so grateful for everything that she put in place before my arrival at the YJI. Her primary research interests include juvenile justice and delinquency, specifically prevention and rehabilitation programming. Her current research also encompasses the more general area of offender rehabilitation and reentry. She has published several pieces focusing on the impact of rehabilitative programming offered in correctional boot camps and aftercare programs. Welcome, Megan. Joining our panel also is Dr. Melissa SICKMUND. Melissa joined the National Center for Juvenile Justice in 1986 and has been at its helm since 2012. Dr. SICKMUND's work at NCJJ has had the goal of improving juvenile justice statistical information and facilitating the use of data to support decision-making at the national and local levels. Dr. SICKMUND oversees NCJJ's work on several national data efforts that include the National Juvenile Court Data Archive, NCJJ's longest running project, the Juvenile Justice Model Data Project, and NCJJ's newest project, and the Survey of Juveniles Charged as Adults in Criminal Court. Dr. SICKMUND is best known for her Juvenile Offenders and Victims publication series, a product of the National Juvenile Justice Data Analysis Program. I want to welcome Dr. SICKMUND to this panel and also acknowledge her many contributions throughout this forum on the chat box and in the format of questions. Thank you so much, Melissa. Also here with us is Vivian TSENG, who is the Senior Vice President of Program at the William T. Grant Foundation. She leads the Foundation's programs, grant-making operations, and initiatives to connect research, policy, and practice to improve child and youth outcomes. In 2009, she launched the Foundation's initiative on the use of research evidence in policy and practice. That program has generated over 50 funded studies and informed the grant-making programs of private and public funders across the country. She has been instrumental in the expanding field of research practice partnerships in the United States, including the creation of field-defining resources and the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships. Welcome, Vivian, to this panel. And to moderate this, I'm sure, incredibly rich conversation, we have here Dr. James Lynch. Dr. Lynch is professor and former chair of the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. He joined the department after serving as the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, in the United States Department of Justice. Previously, Dr. Lynch was a distinguished professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at John Jay College, City University of New York. Dr. Lynch's research focuses on victim surveys, victimization risk, the role of coercion in social control, and crime statistics. He has published 4 books and a multitude of articles, many of them dealing with crime statistics. Thank you so much. Thanks especially to Dr. Lynch for accepting this invitation with very short notice to moderate this conversation. I will pass the baton to you, Dr. Lynch. Thank you.
Thank you, Giza. I appreciate that, and I appreciate being included in this effort. I know a lot of the people around the table, and I'm honored to be with them. I think that you know, looking over the notes from the previous sessions, you had a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives on the COVID problem and what implications that has for various youth populations. And so this particular group is, not surprisingly given their pedigree, is the idea that they're looking at the idea of research, you know, what we need to know and how we need to organize to know it. So that's the general orientation of this group, at least as I've seen it. And so what I'd like to do is start off with a series of questions that Giza has provided and her staff. But before doing that, I'd like to, you know, put out some sort of ground rules. I must confess to being, you know, probably the oldest person on this panel by a fair stretch. And my ineptitude with technology is commensurate with my age. So I think that the idea of how to, the goal here is really to make this an organic conversation, not to have a series of presentations necessarily, but to have an organic conversation. And so to do that, we'll sort of put out the questions for people to mull over and respond to. And if people could use the raise the hand button at the bottom, we'll try and make this as organic as possible. When you don't use those buttons, people have a tendency to talk over one another and the lags and such. So if you could observe that. Now, I realized I was in a conference a few days ago and they had that same ground rule and I ignored it for the entire period. But if you can't do the raise your hand function, if you could just literally raise your hand so that when we see it, we can know to put you on the list for being able to make your contribution to the discussion. So if we can observe those ground rules, I think it'd be more orderly. If we can't, we'll do what we can do, I think. So without going on anymore, let me raise the first question that was posed to us by Giza and her staff. It's a pretty general question, and that is, what have the impacts been of the pandemic on the youth populations that you serve and are interested in? And so when we talk about youth populations, we're also including the emergent adult population as well. So if anyone would like to begin the discussion and start to tell us exactly what the impacts have been on their clients in that sense. I'm not seeing anybody on the panel. Yeah, Tonya just sent me a note here. It says, is this where we should raise our hands? And the answer is yes.
I think I've been unmuted, so I'll jump in because I didn't do that. Yeah, our parent organization at NCJJ is the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And we've had lots and lots of conversations with judges and other court staff about how COVID has affected their functioning. We know that in many places across the country, they pretty easily jumped into doing as much as they could remotely. And that's had some interesting effects. But in other places, courts are still pretty much shut down completely. It raises an interesting research question, and certainly has been discussed amongst the judges and court staff of, you know, what is good of the remote and virtual nature that has occurred. how has it changed access to justice? How has it changed the outcomes that will affect children and families? We've seen in many places where there are, tremendous gains and advantages. The ability to, for example, get interpreter services from any place in the country and not have to rely on someone who can come into your courtroom at that particular moment. That's an advantage. But of course, not everyone has access to the technology. I was fascinated to be on one webinar where people were discussing it, and a woman from Alaska said, well, we've just been using the telephone for years because our community is so remote. It would take them a day and a half to drive to court. We're not going to make people do that. So I think many courts may not have the data capacity to really collect and look at their data to see if it's made a difference in timeliness of case processing and the case outcomes, but that's certainly an interesting research question that we would like to know the answers to as this moves forward.
Thanks, Melissa. Megan, you have your hand up.
Well, I was just going to say, as a professor, so I'm not working directly in the system, I'm more, analyzing youth, and a lot of my research has been on really what impact system contact has long-term on youth through that transition to adulthood. And to me, I see that as a particularly vulnerable population right now because they're already going through such a large transition from being dependent to independent, and the world has become so unstable. So to me, I think one of the important things that I'm thinking about, and that Dr. Powell spoke of, and the other speaker spoke of earlier today, was the importance of a stabilizing factor in these youth life. I know from the system, we always talk about wraparound services. We want to get the kids as much services as possible. But when that's not possible, I think perhaps the best next thing we can do is make sure that there is at least one or two stable resources that they know they can contact via Zoom or via a telephone if you don't have the technology for Zoom. Just knowing that they're not out there alone, especially with the emphasis on trying to keep youth in the community has been a lot on then wrapping around these community services, which just aren't there now. So that's the population I think I'm most concerned about and interested in trying to see how we get them more services, how we get them through this craziness. I don't even want to talk about a new normal yet. I'm still talking about as a crazy world we live in right now, and what kind of support we can get to them.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Lee, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes, this is Lee from DCJS, and we are a criminal justice support agency, which means that we, as Megan said, we're not providing direct services to youth in the field, but our agency is getting information in the door on fingerprintable arrest, for example. So we're able to see what's happening in terms of young people coming through the door. And one of the things that we're seeing in terms of impacts from COVID is just a really dramatic decline in the number of people who are coming in. And so that, early on through mid-March, which is what we've seen so far, there have just been many, many fewer arrests. The courts have been closed, and so there are many fewer hearings happening. So we don't know how long that's going to last, and we're still waiting to take a look at that, but we are seeing that sort of ripple through the system, and so that's one of the very short-term impacts that we're seeing so far at DCJS.
Okay. Now it seems like I think Rebecca, you have your hand up.
Yes, hi, I work for the Office of Children and Family Services, and I was just going to echo what Lee was saying. We do provide direct services or oversee the agencies that do in terms of detention, foster care, juvenile justice placements. And I think as many of the panelists have spoken throughout this week, we have seen tremendous drops in our admissions coming in across all of those services, and are really interested in following up on Prior to COVID hitting, New York State was already seeing a long sustained drop in our confinement populations. This has really accelerated that decline. And understanding what new practices or policies or thoughts were put into place to further decompress those numbers and what might be sustainable as we move back to a new normal and see COVID start to retreat.
Yeah, it's not in Maryland too, and a number of other states. There've been a substantial drop over the last say 10 years or so, and we're seeing it all over the place. It's kind of a puzzle, it wasn't clear from what you said, what all of you said, is that whether, I mean, we say what's the impact, and the impact that you're saying is that the population we serve is not getting served as much, and that's a problem, presumably, because if the services are doing people any good, then they're going to experience things, negative things, if those services aren't in place. Is that a reasonable paraphrase of what people were talking about? Now, correctional services, I mean, that's, people have been trying to get correctional populations down for a long period of time. So in some sense, you would think that that particular impact, which is the decline in the correctional services, would be a positive thing. So it's not just...
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on this. And so first of all, it's really great to be here and with this panel. My organization has been surveying the country in some ways for the last 2 months to understand the impact on the juvenile detention population, specifically the local detention center population during the pandemic. And our latest survey ended up getting responses that cover about 35% of the youth population around the country, including all of New York State as part of it. So it's not a random sample, and we can't claim it's representative, but it's covering a lot of kids. And so the trends that people are talking about, we're really seeing around the country. There was between February and through April, a 52% reduction in admissions to detention centers around the country, and a 32% reduction in the population of the number of kids in custody. So I want to start with that real quick and just say a couple things with that. One, obviously then there's way fewer kids coming in the door, and it raises a lot of questions about why. Is it because arrests are down? Is it because school arrests are not a thing when no kid in America is in school? And what does that mean? So on the one hand, we know all the disparities that may be happening from not having schools open in terms of nutrition, in terms of education. But one thing that may be happening on the other hand is that there becomes no disparities in arrests in school, which we all know of the school to prison pipeline. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the other real question is that typically there's a much tighter relationship between the number of kids getting into secure detention and the number of kids in secure detention. And the fact that the drop in admissions is so much steeper than the drop in the population tells us that places around the country are struggling to get kids out. And it may be for the very reasons that I think are being brought up here about what is there for them at home, and is there a concern that there's not, the service providers aren't able to help them, the things that would typically be placed aren't there. But I want to raise one more point, which is that one of the other things that we found in these data, and while this is a modest analysis, it's nonetheless, the fact that it's across so many places, I think is meaningful. The population of kids in custody has dropped by a greater percentage for Black youth, Latino youth, and Native American youth than it has for white youth. And that is a bigger question to me of all of this, and even our starting point. The idea that our juvenile justice system does more is trying to do good for kids, and so what happens if the services aren't there? We should really raise the question that as the system in all of its ways is backing off, right? Kids aren't getting arrested in school. Seems like there's fewer arrests happening in the community. Probation officers are at home and aren't filing violations of probation. Courts aren't in session. If disparities are dropping in that context, what does it say about the system we'd be going back to in the first place? And so I think that this is a real conflicted question in general about like what are kids not getting? They're not getting maybe some things that are good, but they're probably not getting a lot of things that aren't good either. And I think this is a big question about our, not post-COVID, but just we're in this. What does this mean about juvenile justice right now and where it goes going forward?
I'm trying to look for hands. I think that, I think in some ways that this is something that's going to come in down the road, but you know, many people raise the kind of thing that Nate just raised. That is to say, if the biggest impact of COVID is a diminution in services and a diminution in the use of custodial sentences and things like that, and they raise the question: does this tell us that maybe some of the things we used to be doing we don't have to do anymore? But I do raise a caution in this kind of thing because that, you know, the impact of those changes on the world, on the kids and young emerging adults and other people, and on society, that do we know what that is quite yet? And I think as we go later on in this conversation, we're going to ask, can we possibly know it in the environment of COVID in some ways? Because, you know, you're saying, what's the public safety? People are always going to raise the issue of public safety. They always do. And so the question is, can we even assess that in this climate in some way? So I'll take your question, which is to say, we've got this change, and the change has disrupted the provision of service and the incarceration of youth. And we don't know what the public safety impact of those things are going to be. And so that's something we can deal with later on. But I just wanted to say that. I think we've got Megan had her hand up, and then Melissa.
Tonya had her hand up for a while now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tonya Cook from the Ford Foundation. It's so great to join you here and to see so many people attending this virtual conference. You know, I think Nate's point, that data point about the fact that there have been fewer disparities in this moment of system disruption than in the previous history of the youth justice system is really, really fascinating. You know, I think this moment is like a fantastic opportunity, like a giant, you know, experiment in what happens when youth contact with the system is interrupted, right? Interrupted on a massive scale. And I think although Nate says we don't know all of the reasons for the reduction in admissions, you know, we know just, you know, we know that one piece of that is the fact that kids are not on the street, they're not having contact with police, police are not arresting them in either schools or on the street to the same degree. And James, as I think you pointed out, it's hard to know now what the impact is on public safety because people are not, you know, out in the community in ways that they were before. So the crime rates in general have dropped. But to me, that factoid about the drop in disparity, I think is a really important potential indicator and confirmation of what I think we already know, which is that system contact is rarely, if ever, good for young people and doubly problematic for Black and brown youth, right? You know, I think one of the things that we at Ford have been so interested to see and hope to fund some research around and study of is what are the lessons that will be learned from this pandemic, right? When incarceration has dropped both in jails and prisons, and prison admissions, or rather arrests, are way, 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 way down. What does it mean for practice going forward? Can we live in a world where there is far less reliance on the criminal justice system, right? And I think it's an important moment of reflection and study that should be, you know, that we should be gearing up now. including with, I think, system stakeholders, right? To understand, what can we stop doing, right? What have we been doing that we can stop doing? And in what ways will that, frankly, just be better for kids and for public safety?
Vivian, you have your hand up?
I do, but I didn't want to jump the line. Is it okay?
Well, I thought Megan was just telling me that I was asleep at the switch. So that's why I jumped over Megan, and Melissa already had one shot. So I thought.
Okay. Well, thank you. Apologies to Megan and Melissa. But I did want to just build on what Tonya was just saying. I'm a lifelong researcher, and we fund research. And I think one of the limitations of us as researchers sometimes is that we spend so much time gazing at the problem and trying to better understand what's going on and making sense of it. And I think especially this COVID moment and all the police brutality we're seeing, I think it really calls on us as a research community to pivot pretty quickly to come up with more solution-oriented research and not just problem-focused research. And let me say that I think understanding the extent of the impact and the disparate impacts are very important. But I think if we stay there, we're not as useful to decision makers and system stakeholders as Tanya's calling us to be. And in that regard, I think there are some things that we can anticipate will happen. And so preparing ourselves now to do the kind of research that will be useful for the things that we can pretty much guess are going to happen. I mean, I think when kids do go back to school, a lot of the Black and brown kids that have been most traumatized, whose families have been most traumatized, are going to enter school with all of that experiences. And those schools will also be the ones that are suffering the most. So how can we I think that's a pretty safe anticipation. So how do we take that and now begin working with schools and families and other stakeholders to help them be more responsive to that reality that they are very likely to be facing? And there are all sorts of other things that I think we could safely anticipate and start thinking now about what research do we need to be synthesizing. I would say there's probably a lot we already know from existing research that can be helpful in this moment. Of course, there will be some new research, but new research also takes a very long time sometimes. And so this may not be the time to launch a lot of laborious new studies. Some I'm sure, but being very judicious about that. But trying as much as we can to leverage what we do know as quickly as possible to meet the needs that we know are coming up down the line.
Vivian, thank you. I think Melissa?
Well, and I just sort of wanted to give WT Grant a shout out because we just got a project with them as part of their rapid response research to look into the whole issue of judicial and other decision makers around detention and placement decisions and even transfer to criminal court. We see that things have changed and we need to understand the sort of the calculus of that decision making that has led to so many judges or probation folks around the country saying this child doesn't need to be in detention. If we can better understand it now, how can we make it so it's not just, oh, under COVID, this is going to happen? How can we sort of inoculate the decision makers of the country to be able to move forward with fewer kids in residential placement? Because so we know that so many kids don't really need that. They should be in their community. So how can we keep that going?
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Megan, this is a real one. You're not just telling me I'm not doing my job. So
I just have one comment that just keeps, not just during this panel, but it just keeps rolling around in my head and driving me nuts. So with this distinguished panel, I just want to throw this out here. And this is the fact that we know police are arresting less. We know that we're less likely to get the kid in court. We're less likely to place them. However, we also know that most juvenile crime occurs at school or after school. What occurs in groups So it's just what we're witnessing is not just system behavior, it's also a lack of opportunity for offending among these youth. And as Vivian pointed out, these youth that might have been out there in risky situations are going to be coming back out into more possibly traumatized schools and communities and having gone through more personal trauma from lack of services. So I just think that trying to, even in my head, trying to design a research project where I think of how do I say, was not putting the kid in placement a good thing or a bad thing, becomes difficult because these things are so confounded with each other about whether someone's getting rearrested or not. It's not just system behavior, it's youth behavior, opportunity for offending. And I just wanted to throw that out there in case anyone else had thoughts on that, because it's really just been one of those big sticklers for me trying to even plan a research project. How do you get around that?
I think we'll be able to talk a little bit about that down the line, I hope. But Rebecca?
Hi, I wanted to pick up on a few things. One, Vivian's comment about leveraging what we do know, and do we need new research studies, or how can we capitalize on research and things that are available already? And pair that with some of the themes that I think we've heard throughout the week from the conference. One, about the importance of taking a data-driven and informed approach to conversations. And then the importance of relationships and community empowerment and voice. And to say, sitting at the state level, I think one of the things that we can do at this time to be helpful is to really think about how we get data into the hands of the local communities in a way that is digestible to them, that empowers them to understand their own process with where they are, what they're doing, and look at what innovations or practice changes they've made in an informed perspective, so they can start feeding up to us some of those bright spots about things that may be working that we would want to research further and to promote.
So what kind of thing were you think, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what kind of, can you give an illustration of that kind of innovation?
Well, I think on the technical assistance side, I guess I can say from OCFS's perspective, I think we've worked hard over the last few years to try, particularly in the detention arena, make sure that counties are getting feedback on how they're performing, how they're doing on disparities, what do their admissions and lengths of stay look like? Are they making improvements over time? And then how do they leverage that to look back at their practices that have been occurring that time period and see what is effective in their local communities that they may want to continue. And I see this as an opportunity to get some more of that information in front of folks as things are changing, so they can be very cognizant of where they are and where they're hoping to go.
Thank you. I think Vivian, you had your hand up? I'm sorry, maybe I just...
No, I think even though I've been on Zoom every day for 12 weeks, I'm still learning how to do it. So thanks for bearing with me. I wanted to go back to Megan's challenge, the dilemma that you posed to all of us. And I thought, you know, one thing just as I think about schools, you know, they are in the midst right now of creating their plans for back to school and imagining what back to school is like. And so based on what you're saying, I could, you know, it just sounds to me like there's a wealth of what we already know from existing research about what's likely happening and what will likely happen when schools reopen. And so bringing that synthesis of existing research to the table to inform their back to school planning. And that could be really useful. And then doing it, I'm a big fan of research practice partnerships, these long-term partnerships with stakeholders, to then work with them to study how well is it going, you know, because, you know, people are going to try things and inevitably it will not go as well as we all would hope. And so sticking with them as researchers to study what went well, what didn't, you know, how to improve it, and staying with them over time to try to, in a continuous improvement way, help our systems get better and better. So that could be a combination both of beginning activities, which are really largely about synthesis of existing research, a lot of sort of like technical assistance or consultation on designing their back to school work, and then some new ongoing research to help them understand how well it's going and how to improve.
That seems to dovetail with, I think with what Rebecca just said about getting information on what people are doing so that you know where the partners are who are doing that innovative stuff and can get into collaboration with them as easily as possible. It seems to be consistent in that sense. So Lee, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I also wanted to echo what you and Becky just said about getting data into the hands of the people who can use it. I think it is really helpful and important for the different agencies, the different jurisdictions to have the data available to them. And so DCJS and OCFS and other state agencies I know have worked very hard to do that. And in New York State in particular, I think we're pretty well positioned to make the data available, at the very least through the partnerships that we have with the other state agencies, with the research offices in the courts, at OCFS, and also at DCJS here. So there's a lot of information available and a lot of good opportunities to piece that together. I do also want to echo what Vivian was just saying about the research practice partnerships, and I think we might possibly get into this later with a couple of the later questions, but I think that is a really helpful way to go about doing research. Generally speaking, doing research is a very professional term, but in terms of bringing the most value to a research project is really incorporating practice and practitioners when you're setting up the question, when you're trying to get the information and then answer it.
Leah, can I ask you what? Yeah, I'm concerned about the condition of data. Data collection systems are going to be impacted just the way service providing systems are going to be impacted. The two are very often hand in hand. So it seems like you still have a robust exchange of information with people in your state. Has that been easy to maintain, or is that?
I think where that data transfer is automatic, it doesn't need any intervention from people to do that. So if the courts are closed, but that feed is coming in automatically, that's still continuing. Where it is a manual process, where there is manual data entry into different databases, then for sure the data is slowing down, and it's on pause also until people are back in the office to report.
Thank you. Melissa?
I saw Alicia waving at us, so I didn't know if she had a timeout kind of thing, but I think the data issue is definitely key, and in general I think we need, I would maybe for a later question, the need to improve data capacity, not just data collection, but the ability to analyze, synthesize, use the data to guide decision making, I think is going to be key. And I would say the idea of states really should take responsibility for providing data in useful, digestible forms back down to the counties and the local service providers, because the states, I think, have a better capacity to do that than the individual service providers and even counties do. We used to do that for the state of Pennsylvania. I don't know why more places don't do it. Some states do it very well.
So let me, Alyssa is waving frantically at me, but I can't see her. But because the time allotted for this particular question has been, we've reached the end of that. So I want to circle back. I think in our last segment, we'll sort of circle back to some of the themes that you all have brought up. But we want to move on to sort of, I think, a much more kind of a difficult question, in the sense that the pandemic has sort of further illuminated and exacerbated the effects of structural inequities. That life is a lot harder. It's no accident that poor people and people from minority groups are more infected, and they can't stay at home. There's a whole bunch of things that people have identified. So that what concrete ways can research and philanthropy sort of seize the moment, I think, to further address the root causes of these inequities? I mean, the fact that COVID has made them more visible. What kind of research, what kinds of programmatic activity could be done to drive that point home? I think, Vivian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I so appreciate this question, because even before COVID happened, our foundation's been doing some deep reflections on this issue. So one of our two major areas of work is on reducing inequality in youth outcomes. And we've talked about it as studying policies, programs, and practices to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. And we funded some great work. But what we realized is that when we framed it in that way, what we've ended up doing is funding a lot of research on how to mitigate the effects of racism, how to mitigate the effects of class divides on youth outcomes, how to mitigate the effects of inequality, because a lot of the work that we have funded, sorry, that's an ambulance or something going by, doesn't tackle the structural forces that create and recreate racism and class inequality. And so we're right in the middle of trying to reimagine what research would look like that does target those structural forces. And one way we've been thinking about it is research on disrupting power hierarchies. Because there are the existing power hierarchies that make it easier for us to try to mitigate the effects of structural inequality, rather than trying to disrupt the hierarchies of power that exist and that serve to maintain racism and classism. And so examples of that could be work on social movements, more research on social movements. And here again, not the theoretical work on social movements, but on what research do movement organizers and movement leaders need in order to be more successful and more impactful in their work. It could also be research on elite decision makers, those who sit at the top of the power hierarchy. And again, not just on their decision making, but what are ways of disrupting that elite decision making processes and the structures that maintain elite decision making. So just trying to think more creatively about the kind of work we can do to disrupt power hierarchies.
So let me see if I understand, Vivian. What you're saying is that for a long time, your group has sort of tried to mitigate the negative effects of inequality, and now you're saying, well, you're going to go at it in terms of, it sounds like sort of power changes, or trying to change the distribution of power in one way or another, or get into the political and advocacy process. Is that, did I misconstrue that?
Well, I wouldn't say that, we have figured it out, but certainly these are the conversations that we're having, that we were having even pre-COVID, and COVID, and also the police brutality we see every 5 minutes on TV is bringing that conversation even more to the foreground. Yeah.
So I think Melissa had her hand up, and then Megan.
Yeah, I sort of want to echo what Vivian said, and then I have a little other point. But yeah, I mean, when Michael this morning was talking about, to have more training on implicit bias and cultural responsiveness, it's like, yes, except we need to stop that being the thing. A lot of places have done that. There have been a lot of reforms in juvenile justice, and yet sometimes, I think a lot of the JDAI sites have seen disparities actually get worse. So it's time to use this opportunity, and it may be more the racial focus right now that gives us the opportunity to really tap into, document and identify and call out the systemic racism that exists, and to conduct research like Vivian was talking about to try to get rid of it. The power structure thing leads me to Our organization has been bringing together other similar kind of membership organizations in the justice space to just look at diversity in our own membership and in the things that feed the positions of power in the justice system. I think universities could certainly do the same thing. You know, you might, you know, have diversity amongst your students, but what about your graduate students? What about your professors? What about the chairs of departments, the key decision makers? Certainly, the ABA publishes a nice report that looks at law student entries and exits and law firms and Supreme Court justices. There's a database about state court judges, but the fact that most of the kids in the system are kids of color and most of the decision makers in the system are not people of color is a problem. And it's not going to, I mean, I think a lot of the disparities in decision making are not going to go away until there's more diversity on the bench and in other key positions.
Megan?
Hi, yeah, well, two things. One, Nate had posed a question here for us, I saw on the chat, that I think went back to what Vivian was saying a little bit, but from the other direction about the people in power. Nate was kind of posing the question about what about talking more to the communities and seeing what data they have available. So I'd like to turn it to him after me so that we can address his question he posted. But I just wanted to chime in. I think that as we move forward in researching this, it's going to be very, very important to engage the youth themselves, in addition to the communities that Nate's going to be speaking about. We can sit here and ponder all day what effect did this have on the youth. And we can imagine what effect it had on the youth from what we already know from research. But I think that really engaging youth, both in placement and those that we're supposed to be getting services at home, is really important. And it's something that we can do immediately. It's not something we have to wait a year or two lag for the administrative data to catch up to what's really going on. So that's somewhere that I'd like to see the research go in the future. Immediate future is really talking to these youth and engaging them in this process. And with that, Jim, if you don't mind, I just feel like Nate's been trying to get this question out there and might have had a problem with his hand raising function.
No, I think, I'm sorry, I see Nate. Are you, did I miss somebody else?
No, just Nate.
Yeah.
Nate, okay.
Thank you. Sorry, yeah, I should know how to raise my hand after all these years. But so let me, so I think one thing I wanted to say is knowing that there are people on this who work across systems. I think one of the most frustrating things to hear from place to place is every system you go and work with can tell you the 3 neighborhoods where all the kids come from, or the 5 neighborhoods where all the kids come from, whatever it is. And it's the same neighborhoods that the child welfare system will tell you that the kids come from. It'll be the same places with the most struggling schools. And I think, so when we talk about where can we go for root causes, I think one of the more frustrating things, and yet one of the opportunities in this moment, that as states are going to face these crippling budget cuts, and localities will, is where do you put your money? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it's like, what are you investing in and where? Are you going to invest in the communities where kids just simply don't have the opportunities other young people have? I mean, I thought the point that got brought up earlier about we don't know what's going to happen when kids can get back together. I mean, largely kids get back together and they hang out with each other and they do what kids do with each other. And the question is, are we going to give them opportunities to do that in a productive way, or are we not? It's on us. Like, it's not on them. I'm thinking about this because I saw a question that I think someone asked on the side that was about, what do we think is going to happen with young people in the streets right now protesting, and about arrests, and are we going to see more detention going up or not? And I know the question I want to ask to the people here who represent the state agency in New York, for example, is how do we make probation encourage participation by young people in protests? Because one of the things that we would want for kids who we care about, or one of the things that we would say as part of youth development, and that we cry out that we need more of, is civic engagement. Learning about how you use your voice and how you do things. And yet I wonder how many probation departments across the country would make it a condition that they can't go out and protest, instead of actually encouraging it as something that we do. And so I think this is always difficult, because especially when it comes to the question of at a philanthropic level, what do you do when there's issues around root causes? And yet all the philanthropy in the world is a tiny drop in the bucket in some way compared to the massive decades-long, centuries-long impacts of structural racism in this country. But there are things that can happen right now in terms of where the funding goes and the decisions that states are going to make. And that's one of the reasons why, to me, it's like the opportunity now when the facilities are smaller, when they should be able to close, now's the time to do it, to not make it an option, and so that you're using the funding on things that we know. When I hear kids are going back to school and they're going to need all these supports, yes, they will. Like, they're going to need it, and that's where it should be provided. It should be provided there, and not after you lock the kid up for doing something stupid.
Well, that was a whole lot of stuff in one short presentation. I think that, but I wanted to, since there's no hands up that I can see, that I wanted to ask a question just to follow up. The first to Megan, you talk about engaging the youth themselves. What do you mean? Do you mean civic engagement, the way Nate is talking about it, or what do you mean?
Well, two things. I mean engaging the youth in our conversations, so we hear their voices about what they're experiencing, and this would include not just black and brown youth, white youth as well, in rural areas that might be not getting services. It would include everybody coming to the table. And, you know, I've been at many meetings where they talk about we need more youth engagement, and then, you know, you spend hours and hours debating what does that mean, and no youth ever gets to the table. And I think that bringing the youth to the table to start with is where you start, and then you figure out how to use their voice and where it applies. But I think if we just sit around and ponder what that means, we never move forward. But I think particularly what COVID does bring out, even before the crisis we're going through right now in the country, or I shouldn't even say before, it had the institutional racism forever. It's just in our face more right now, and people have to struggle with things that they prefer to swipe under a rug and think it doesn't exist. I think that we need to really focus on these communities and on what does it mean for them. It was one of the panels earlier that they spoke about how many of these youth are not just being cared for by a parent, but by a grandparent. Right? So they might have an elderly person that's more susceptible to COVID and in danger from it, and that has to change their interactions and how they think. And you know, I'm trying to help my grandsons with their homeschooling, and I don't think I'm that out of technology, but boy, it's difficult for me. So I can't imagine for, you know, a 70-year-old grandmother trying to figure out how to upload these projects and do this. So I just think that we need to hear from the youth, and I'm going to extend it here to be also from their caregivers, what are the challenges in working in this type of environment? Because if we are looking to keep more kids at home moving forward, we have to truly understand what are the good things about that, but also there are some possible struggles and bad things from that. But I wanted to end with, Jim, you're gonna yell at me, but I've seen Tanya's hand up for a while, so I just want to.
Really? I'm sorry. No, thank God you're there, because actually,
thank you.
You know what? Her hand isn't.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly get in, Jim, on this issue of youth involvement participation. You know, I think one area where we could use more research and more attention is on the power of youth organizing, right? This is more than just asking young people what they think. It's asking young people what they need and investing in them to help make those solutions. And just this week, we've had some really, really powerful examples of this, which John Powell alluded to in his remarks. First is that a coalition of mainly young Black organizers this week got the LA mayor to commit to divesting $150 million in police and putting that money in pro-social investments in Black communities. That is unprecedented. right? But it's the culmination of several years of organizing by largely young people around the country who are saying the criminal justice system is not only not helping us, it's killing us and it's undermining us, right? And that there's a different path to public safety, right? And I think that this is the kind of work where participatory action research can be really, really useful, where researchers are doing it alongside most affected, directly affected young people. Also this week, just yesterday, the Minneapolis School Board voted to end the contract for police in schools, right? They called a special session to vote only on that because, again, young people and Black folks in heavily incarcerated and justice-involved communities were calling for it for years. And I think the George Floyd situation just made it so manifest why it's critical to do that. The Portland superintendent this week is ending the contract with police in schools, right? The Denver School Board is putting forward a resolution to do the same. Again, this is work that is an expression of what young people are saying, right? And I think it's important that we both listen to it, that funders are funding it, and that researchers are paying attention. I would also just say that I think the link to COVID here is that this pandemic is obviously going to have devastating impacts on highly impacted justice-involved communities, right? The economic impacts alone, much less the public health ones, are enormous. And budgets are going into austerity on the city, on the state, on the county level, on the federal government level. And so this is a time to begin really focusing on how do we advocate and how do researchers point to the importance of investing in those communities, right? And pro-social investments, whether it's, family systems therapy, whether it's the availability of trauma services, whether it's supports to schools and after school programs, all of those things that we know make for healthy young people, right? And are going to be critical in a post-COVID moment when, as I think somebody else on the panel said, so many traumatized children and children who are now going to be a year or more behind academically are going back into our institutions, both schools and streets, right, where they are liable to get criminalized.
Thanks, Tanya. I think I'm a total favorite sharing my screen so that everybody's on the screen. So I think people are probably going to have to go back to the old school, which is yelling. So, or else Megan will just police the whole damn thing. So it's her. I think we have to move on. I think to the final question, but I wanted to go back to Nate, and you started talking about the concentration of youth problems, the concentration of COVID and all those kind of things. Were you talking about a community emphasis in these kind of efforts because of the concentration?
I'm not sure the question exactly, but I'm talking about like generally across juvenile justice, the young people tend to come who are confined and who are on probation tend to come disproportionately from very small pockets of a place. New York City, you could talk in a gigantic city, you can basically pinpoint 3 places where it's like, this is where the kids are coming from. And so my point was that when we talk about community engagement, I really appreciate the points that others are making, and that it's not just generally let's listen to young people. I mean, I think there are just a lot of places where we know from city to city or from county to county where we see large concentrations, and we need to focus our efforts there. It's not enough to say, well, we have the kids from there because that's the places where kids are carrying guns. That suggests that the issue is not about the individual behavior of kids, but about an issue that's more systemic than that. And so to treat the kids as a way that they're the problem, they're the issue, and that's why we need to put them in detention or send them to placement, sort of misses the point. So that's all I was commenting about that. And I imagine the same thing will show up in terms of COVID cases and what we're seeing as we do for all these other factors.
Great, thanks. Melissa, you have the last word, and then we'll move on to the next question.
When Nate was talking before, it just struck me that, you know, some states have made a big effort in kind of juvenile justice reinvestment, taking monies from the deep end of the system and putting it instead to the front end of the system, to which I would say, well, let's put it earlier than that. Let's put the funding in the communities so that maybe we can help families not have to get sucked into the child welfare system and then into the juvenile justice system. Let's really have justice reinvestment that is, you know, supporting those communities, which, given all the current stuff going on, are going to be in a terrible economic and health crisis, you know, in the next several months. So maybe the philanthropic community can help out with that, because the governments are not going to have the money. They're not going to have the budgets.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question that we've been asked to address. And I think so I think you brought up many things relevant to this particular topic already, but it says the idea is how can we build upon existing research to inform the path going forward? So this is a multifaceted question. So the first one is, what can we do with existing research? I think Vivian has already said some things about that. What new important areas of research are coming out of the pandemic? Again, you said a number of things that fit that bill. And finally, what resources and access are needed to address these new areas of inquiry? We need to reorganize the funding process, the research process, whatever. So if we can start in the beginning, which is, what can we build upon in existing research to inform the path going forward? Vivian, you have your hand up.
So I think one thing we could do that maybe we don't always do enough of is to learn across systems. So, you know, folks who are researchers who know a lot about criminal justice involvement and what's going on in that space, working more with education researchers and education practitioners. Like in my previous example, to help us plan ahead in a more aligned, integrated way for back to school, for example. Stronger alignment between mental health researchers and those working in the justice system or the education system, because we know that there is a lot of trauma that is occurring that will need to be addressed. So these are things we can anticipate, and there's might be so much more that we could do if we spend this period really aligning our efforts to try to bring to bear everything we know from different bodies of research. Because as someone said, or maybe a couple of people have said, these are the same kids touching so many of the same systems, and yet we still continue to silo our research community in these different ways.
You know, it's interesting that in the state of Maryland, until like 2 years ago, you couldn't get the SLED data, the education data. You couldn't merge it with juvenile history data to do any kind of research about school and the interrelationships in school. It was prohibited by law. And so then there's a lot of barriers to be broken down, I think, in terms of getting those domains to speak to each other. Again, Melissa, and then Megan after that.
I would just, definitely echo that. I mean, our organization does a lot of work across the child welfare, juvenile justice barrier, but I think also to have criminal justice and juvenile justice researchers work with other social sciences. There's a lot of work going on by economists that I would guess that most of us don't read on a regular basis. And they do have a different way of approaching the questions even that I think we could really learn a lot from some collaborations where we're talking about different fields of social science to address criminal justice problems. Juvenile justice.
Megan?
Well, mine was pretty simple, and it just goes back, you asked how can we build upon current research. So part of it's like, we do know what puts kids at risk, right? And we know the impact of trauma and ACEs. So when we move forward with research on COVID, we have a framework for that research and how is this impacting those risk factors. We also have some ideas about what are protective or promotive factors that help kids overcome that. And that helps us to guide our services and our resources. But building from there, we also know from sociology, which is my background, going back to Sean McKay and social disorganization theory and the roots of, it's not the kid, it's the community, that even when a social attention is clearly brought to the disorganization and the dysfunction of the community and poverty, that the solutions that come out of that tend to revert to the kid, not fixing the community. We always want to fix the kid because that seems a simpler process. It doesn't challenge people as much, doesn't cost, well, people think it doesn't cost as much, but I also think we have research on prevention programs, again, like just way back to the Perry Preschool Project, that when you do invest in communities and you invest in resources and you give kids a path forward, you save a lot of money. But for some reason, I guess to me, it's, we know a lot in research, but we're not translating it well to policymakers in the way that invokes or forces change. So I think that is the challenge for me as a researcher moving forward, is how do I get the focus off the kid and onto the real problems?
All right, Vivian?
I just want to make a plug for one other area of research, and that's research on positive youth development and adolescent development. And I say this because I think in the justice system, there's often a pathologizing of youth or a deficit model orientation to young people. But over the last few decades, there's wonderful work going on about positive youth development and things like, there's a huge area of work on ethnic and racial identity development. How do we create systems, communities, families, schools that nurture a really healthy sense of ethnic and racial identity? There's also a wonderful body of research on parenting and healthy family relationships within communities of color, and about the richness of multi-generational households and all of these things. And so it just strikes me that if we could also shift some of our framing in the ways we think about Black and brown young people and their families, that might also shift some of the ways in which we think about the systems and the system actors respond to them. So I just want to make a pitch for that sort of positive youth development, positive adolescent development research.
Leigh?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what Megan just said and really support that statement about translating research into policy on one hand, but also practice on the other hand. And I think what we're trying to find is some solutions that will help practice. And so if the practitioners aren't the ones who are able to understand it, or if they don't have access to the findings, or if it isn't translated in a way that's really accessible to them, it's sort of a lost opportunity. And so that feels like a really important step to have, which I think as many people have mentioned throughout, certainly today and previously, is having the practitioners in the room, having the youth in the room, having the families in the room when we're asking and trying to figure out how to answer those questions is seems like that's an important step to take as well.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I just wanted to pick back up on the piece that was mentioned. I think it was Melissa, for looking to funders potentially for supporting those very important primary prevention programs in communities that we know were stressed prior to COVID, are going to be experiencing more stress going forward and having fewer resources available. But I know from our work with our local counties and communities, it can be very powerful when they have prevention dollars where they can make an investment and we can combine sort of private funding for those prevention services the collaboration with state and university partners to do the research to show the impact of those programs, so that they can go back to their local county governments when they're making investments and have actual data to put in front of them about how this does help them long term, right? That it's a good investment. And I think there's a real opportunity here for us to partner, if there's dollars available to support the programs, to have universities and states contributing with the research and the evaluation side.
Nate?
I would, just two things. I really appreciate the emphasis that Vivian's placing on positive youth development, because I think it's one of those things in our field that can just become something people say, and yet how do we actually see it in practice is a different thing. And so actually being able to demonstrate what it looks like as a true model for how the system works with young people and understand the outcomes would be great. I think the second thing is diversion, which can mean a lot of things, but a truly community-centered diversion process like Los Angeles County has been beginning to implement, really understanding how that works, because I feel like diversion has I think it sounds to so many people like doing nothing or no consequences, as opposed to sort of diverting towards something. And I think being able to research it, we know the rates of diversion in our country are so much lower than what they are of other countries around the world in terms of how they react to young people when they first hit the system one way or another, by police or otherwise. And it seems like it's one of those that needs more advocacy. And I think part of that comes from having better research about what that actually looks like.
So I think that it's very helpful to talk about existing research and existing models of research and how they can prepare us for looking at COVID and understanding, including the world after COVID. But I think that we need to switch, I think, at this point to the final question here, which is, is the idea that what important new areas of research are coming out of the pandemic?
Tanya, you have your hand up.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry, Tanya. I just can't get you on the screen.
No problem. It's hard to see everybody on the screen at once on the side, I know. You know, this isn't so much a COVID specific research request, but it is a COVID, one that COVID is implicating, and that is the following. You know, we know that COVID is decimating budgets. And if we are instructed by what we saw during the Great Recession in 2008, we know that tight government budgets are an opportunity for decarceration. It's an opportunity for system diversion because, the corrections budget is one of the few more discretionary areas of state and local budgets, right? So there is and will be a new incentive to cut. And it seems to me that we need to be prepared to argue and to, with research, strengthen our arguments for diversion. As Nate was just saying, this country has one of the lowest rates of diversion in the United States. A lot of that happens, to the degree it happens informally, we know, right? When police call a young white kid's parents instead of actually arresting and, referring them to prosecution. And, I'll just repeat here what my friend Vinnie Schiraldi says, that, the system has a process for diversion, it's white skin, right? And, but to the extent that our kids and kids of color are getting referred to the system, how do we get them out before they're adjudicated, right? And this is where a lot of the young people and the young organizers in the field are really calling for an expansion of restorative justice and restorative practices. Practices in school settings as an alternative to arrest and suspension, and restorative justice in youth justice settings. At Ford, we've been eager to fund more of that work, but I'll tell you, there are so few programs of any size, scale, right? And, you know, we've been asking questions, why is that? You know, this is a mediation process that we think has, and a lot of young people think has great potential for better youth outcomes, right? Not just non-incarcerative outcomes, but ones where you're able to get young people to reflect, and that the little tiny bit of research we have suggests better youth outcomes, at least in other countries where most of the research has been done. And I would really make a plea to researchers to help do some high quality studies on the impact of restorative justice diversion practices, and not just in terms of their ability to lower recidivism rates, which seems promising, again, from many of the studies done overseas, but also on youth outcomes, right? What are the outcomes for you know, school retention and graduation? What are the outcomes in terms of youth employment? What are the outcomes in terms of youth? And also, I should say, crime survivor, you know, victim well-being. And this is a research agenda that is super important to carry out in concert with court systems and prosecutors, right? Who are the gatekeepers of diversion and who by and large have, you know, not taken up restorative justice or assumed that it's a slap on the wrist.
Great. Thank you very much, Tonya. I'd like to, we can get in Vivian and then Megan, and I think then we'll be pretty much out of time.
Hey. If it's okay, I'm going to take a different angle on this question, which is because I think Tonya has spoken to a lot of important issues that need to be researched. I'd like to switch it to a frame to the ways we go about research going ahead, because I think we need to meet this moment by fundamentally questioning the ways we've traditionally gone about our research work as a community. And I include us as research funders in that. So one, I would say more research practice partnership work. True, meaningful, authentic partnership, which is long-term. It's not drop-in, drop-out research. It's done in collaboration where they're jointly defined research agendas that are genuinely useful to whoever the partner is, whether it's a community-based organization, an advocate, an agency leader or manager. So more research practice partnerships. Two, more syntheses of existing knowledge to meet the needs that people have today or tomorrow, and not just always conducting new research, but more syntheses. Three, more cross-system work that's centered on positive youth development. So breaking some of the silos that we are in as a research community. And then four is that thinking more expansively about the roles for researchers, that researchers don't just conduct research. If we limit our role as primarily the conductors of research, we limit our potential contributions in this moment and beyond. And so our roles being consulting with systems and agencies as they think about their work, being advocates, and advocating for what we know based on research, and being thought partners with folks, not coming in with the experts and all of the answers, but really being thought partners with folks as they work through some very difficult issues. I think that's going to be very controversial for some researchers who think of their work primarily as doing research. But I think if we go about these roles in evidence-based ways that are true to the evidence as we understand them, then we can be more expansive and maintain our credibility, more expansive in the roles that we play, as well as maintaining true to our credibility as rigorous researchers.
Great. Thanks, Vivian, very much. I think, Megan, you have the last word.
Okay, so I'll go back to more traditional research approaches, and I wanted to talk about how all the forced innovation during COVID, not just within the juvenile system, but within the healthcare system, within education, within social welfare, across the board, brings up an opportunity to really look at what works and what doesn't work in these alternative settings, right? From a research design, one day we were doing the old normal, now all of a sudden there's all these new creative programs happening. It's a huge opportunity for people to go out and research what worked and what didn't work in those settings. And when we find what works, if those programs help us keep more kids out of institutional settings and better able to get services in the home, then that's very exciting. We could even, as we go back to whatever the new normal is, maybe think about randomized designs where, you know, some kids get the old way of treatment, some kids get the new ways of treatment. I know practitioners hate when we talk about randomized designs, but it really is the best way of figuring out what works for these youth and what doesn't work. And I highly encourage us, as we do this, to learn from other research that's been done after other national disasters and traumas, such as Katrina. Even though COVID is new, national disasters and trauma aren't. So I think there's a lot for us to model our research upon going forward. And that will be, I know we're out of time, so I will sum it up there. I hope we don't let this great opportunity to learn about new approaches, cross-system approaches, pass us by.
Talk about making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. That was terrific. But I want to thank you all for participating. You've just raised the time. I got 6 pages worth of questions flowing out from what you all have said. And I'm sure that Giza and her staff will continue to pump these themes because I thought it was great. And so I think I'm going to Alicia, and you can put me out of my misery and move the baton to Giza.
Thank you so much, Jim, for your moderation of this engaging and lively conversation. I feel we were a little unfair to you. We put you on one side of a ping pong match, and we had all the balls coming at you, and you survived under pressure. I'm pretty sure I would not have. So thank you so much for that. Thanks to the panelists for your engaging discussion. I'd love to echo some things back to you, and to piggyback on what Jim said, yes, this conversation will go on. I'm glad to hear that he took so many notes. I have a similar amount here in front of me, as I'm sure my team does too. We did not give the audience an opportunity to ask questions in this session, but I want to invite everybody to visit our Padlet, our virtual bulletin board, and put your questions there. And to the extent that the panelists are available and interested, we will pass on those questions to them and facilitate the conversation. I also want to remind everybody that we will stay in touch. If you hear from us too much, feel free to tell us you don't want to receive correspondence anymore as attendees. We are very hopeful that we will congregate again in 6 months or so to take stock of what has happened since this discussion. But as I said, I wanted to echo a couple of things back to you. The importance of translational efforts, I think, cannot be understated, and we should take to heart the opportunity that we had to learn from epidemiologists on how to do that during this crisis, right? I think we are all glued to our screens and have bookmarked favorite websites with dashboards and whatnot. I think that there's a lot that's being done in this area with data on COVID and prevalence that we can learn from that makes it intuitive and palatable as a way of consuming data and information. The other thing I'd like to echo back to you is something that Jim raised and several of you remarked on, the condition of the data, right? Doing data live in the middle of a pandemic is challenging, to say the least. But what I would like to do is carve out some space for qualitative research that's rigorous, that should be done precisely now as we can apprehend the narratives of those going through the pandemic. Doing that later has great value as oral history, but doing it now, I think, is an opportunity. All right, I cannot thank you enough. I want to thank our attendees and all of our panelists and moderators throughout these 4 days. It feels like 100 for us here on the other side of the screen and with the YJI. By all accounts, I hope that you found this to be a successful convening of ideas and suggestions, and I look forward to continue this conversation with you throughout the next months. Thank you.